So when I gave the presentation on Operation Freshman previously on the 80th anniversary, it was about the raid. Some of you have heard that presentation. Some of you may have seen it online. For the benefit of those who didn't see it, I will spend the first part of the talk talking about the raid and the background and what happened, and then the latter part will be more on the war crimes investigations and trials and so on, which is the part of the research that I'm most involved with right now. But I will give a full rundown on the actual raid itself. So what was the background to Freshman? In the 1930s, there were significant advances, scientific advances on understanding the structure of the atom and the potential uses of splitting the atom and creating vast amounts of energy. There were many research groups working on this in Germany, in the UK, France, Poland, the US, and it was a fairly open communication at the time, very of academic interest, and they had the usual conferences, published papers, and looking at what you could do with atomic energy. And a lot of people were looking at the peaceful aspects of it, creating an unlimited source of energy for the benefit of mankind. And of course, whenever you have a new technical development, there's always somebody who sees a potential military aspect of it. And you create vast amounts of energy that can also be used in explosive devices. And quite early on, it was recognized that it had potential to actually create a super bomb bigger than anything that anybody had any idea about. So once that happened, once people started to realize there was a military potential to it, then the cooperation started to stop, and these conferences stopped, and people from different countries didn't talk to each other anymore about it. One of the aspects of this research was, if you're going to build a nuclear reactor, you need certain components. And heavy water, deuterium oxide, was one of those components that was looked at. It's what's called a moderator, and it allows you to control the reaction in a nuclear reactor. And so heavy water was recognized early on as being one of those moderators that you would need if you were going to build a nuclear reactor. The only source of heavy water at that time in any kind of quantity was in the Norsk Hydro factory at Vemork in Norway. And it wasn't a product that they were producing to sell. They didn't actually know particularly what to do with it. All kinds of possible benefits were considered, but they didn't really know. It was a byproduct of the production there. It was mostly, the production at Vemork was for fertilizer, ultimately. So that's what, you had a big power station, but it was all to do with making fertilizer. But heavy water was collected, and when the Germans invaded in 1940, they obviously took over the infrastructure in Norway. And at a point in time, intelligence reached the Allies that the Germans had asked for a massive increase in the production of heavy water. Huge increase. And that instantly alerted people in the UK and in the US that the only reason they could think of that the Germans would want suddenly to have massive amounts of heavy water was that they were looking into the potential to make an atomic bomb, or they were at least carrying out research into this. That got them very worried, and so a decision was made that this had to be stopped, and that the facility had to be destroyed. So that's really, in short, the background. So once you've made that decision, then you need to think, okay, how can we do this? How can we destroy this facility? And a number of options were looked at. Bombing was one. The factory is in a very deep, narrow valley in a remote area of Norway. So actually bombing something like this is not very practical. So that's it up there. The Germans had laid anti-aircraft cables across the valley in 3 places, so you couldn't get low-flying aircraft coming in. The facility itself, the heavy water cellar, the actual part of the factory that's producing heavy water is really quite small and is down in the basement down here. So bombing that, one, you'd have a challenge actually getting to the cellar. This is all concrete. So actually hitting the cellar would be tough. You have settlements all around. There's a town further down here in Rjukan, and also Vemork itself. The chance of hitting civilians is very high. And so they decided not to go for the bombing option at this time. Internal sabotage was considered. Internal sabotage happened. So workers in the Norsk Hydro factory, they were adding oil into the process, so contaminating the heavy water. But the problem is that's not sustainable over the long term, because the Germans would have found out ultimately, and the consequences for local civilian workers would have been severe. They would almost certainly have been executed if they'd been caught. So it slowed things down for a little while, but it's not an option you want to consider long term. Special Operations Executive Sabotage Party was considered, and ultimately that's how they successfully destroyed the cellar the following year. But at the time, combined operations were starting to flex its muscles and find a purpose, and they felt that SOE weren't trained enough and ready to carry out an operation this scale, and so it was decided to do a combined operations raid. So there were a number of ways considered to get men into the area. Remember, this is a remote area in Norway, and they looked at flying boats initially. There are a lot of lakes in the area that you could land the flying boat on potentially, get the men in, down to the factory, do the job, come back up, get on the plane, fly home, ready for your breakfast in the morning. All sounds very nice, not at all practical. It's winter when this was considered. The lakes were starting to freeze over. Flying boats were incredibly valuable at the time. They were used for anti-submarine patrols. There weren't that many of them, and there's just no way Coastal Command would have released 2 or 3 flying boats for something so risky. They couldn't afford to lose aircraft like this. So that was ruled out. Then paratroopers were considered. There were paratroopers that could have done this task, but they were assigned for other missions in the Middle East at the time. And the trouble with using paratroopers in an area like this, Hardangervidda is a very cold, windy, remote place. And they decided they needed about 30 men to carry out the task. They needed 15 to do the job, and they decided to double it, just in case something happened with the first group. 30 men. If you are trying to get 30 men out of 2 Halifax aircraft and gather them and the equipment on the Hardangervidda with high winds, snow, whatever conditions you might get there, you would have scattered them. It would have taken a long time to get everybody together. The longer you're out there, the more chance you are of being discovered and the mission security compromised. So they decided at the end of the day to try to insert 2 Horsa gliders into a landing site close by to the facility, towed by 2 Halifax bombers. So that was the option that was eventually decided on. The decision was made very, very close to the actual raid itself. So the final call wasn't made until very close to the raid. But that's how they decided to do it. This is the kind of time frame. So you can see September 1942, the raid was first proposed, the chiefs of staff. 7th of October, you had the first meeting with Combined Operations Headquarters, the Airborne Division and 30 went. So that's 7th of October, and the raid went on the 19th of November. So you have all these other elements to fit in that time. 19th of October is when the sapper volunteers were asked for. The aircrews were assigned on the 24th, and the confirmation of using gliders came on the 24th of October. So you can see there's quite a compressed time frame to do something so complex, but that's the frame they were working with. So the mission objectives, and this is very important, to destroy the strokes of Lurgan. Lurgan is the code name they gave to heavy water. Heavy water, as soon as they decided to do this back in September, the phrase heavy water was banned from all official communications and meetings. Nobody talked about heavy water in case the intelligence leaked out that they were interested in doing something with it. So Lurgan, which is like a Scottish disease, that's the code word that was used. But that front line is important. It says destroy the stocks of Lurgan. That's the heavy water that had been made and the means to produce it. That's key. So what that meant was destroying not only the heavy water cellar on the top picture there, but also the generators. That's why you needed so many men to take this task. To blow up all those generators and the heavy water cellar, you need a lot of explosives. That means a lot of men to do this. Gunner side, the successful operation the following year, they only attacked the heavy water cellar. They did not touch the generating capacity. So although the raid was super successful and they did destroy the facility, it didn't stop production for that long. They had estimated a year and a half. They were in production again after months. Okay? So the means to produce it. The gliders were planned to arrive in an evening after about 3.5 hours flying time. There would be Norwegian SOE agents there, the grouse team, to meet them, take them to the objective. 5 to 6 hours with all that kit and explosives, 5 to 6 hours in snow. There was a road which they could have marched down, and they would have done. But 5 to 6 hours. So 3.5 hours in a glider, 12,000 feet, plywood glider, bouncing up and down in the November cold. 5 to 6 hours walk down to the factory, then do the attack. And when you've done the attack, make your escape on foot to Sweden. The raid was seen as so important that it said, anybody's injured or wounded, just leave them. Main thing is to get to the objective, do the job. Detection, no excuse for halting. The escape plan was get as far away from the objective within 24 hours, leave the factories in pairs and threes. If you've had an engagement, somebody's been wounded or killed, that means your pair may no longer be a pair. So you have that confusion to deal with. They were clothed in British Army uniforms with no insignia. And underneath the uniforms, they had blue jumpers, woolen jumpers, and blue woolen ski trousers, which were supposed to be part of their escape disguise. Come back to that later. But essentially, once they'd done the raid, the 3.5 hours flying, 5 to 6 hours walking there, attack the factory, get out, make your way back into the mountains, and head to Sweden. 230 kilometers as the crow flies. They're not crows. They had 10 days rations. It would have been tough. It would have been tough. The units selected, so you had 4 SOE operatives who later joined the gunner side team, the all famous guys in Norway. You had 14 aircrew, the crews of 2 Halifax bombers. There were 2 regular Whitley crews, which are smaller than a Halifax crew, to which you added flight engineers and an extra navigator for the purpose of this mission. Experience-wise, on both those Halifax crews, about 3 or 4 had extensive combat experience from Coastal Command or from Bomber Command, but the vast majority, this was more or less their first overseas mission, other than the nickeling raid that they had, which I'll mention later. You had 4 glider pilots, 2 British, 2 Australian. The Australians had taken part in the training of leading up to freshmen, and they specially asked to go. They were really top quality pilots, all these guys, but they asked permission to go, because normally you would just use the glider pilot regiment, but these 2 guys asked to go, and they were given permission. And then you had the 30 Royal Engineer volunteers, 20 from the 9th Field Company, and 10 from the 261st Field Park Company, all assigned to the Airborne Division. Some of the 9th Company guys had experience from the British Expeditionary Force, had been at Dunkirk, so some of them had combat experience, but most of them did not. Something that I only found out relatively recently in my research was that I knew that there'd been a mission asked for by Lieutenant Colonel Henniker, who was the military commander for the raid. He had asked specifically for aerial photographs of the glider landing site at Hardangervidda. And there was quite a lot of aerial photographs taken previously in previous missions, and this is one of them there, of the factory itself. But he insisted on getting photographs of the glider landing site. So on the 17th of October, PRU Mosquito took off from Lookers in Scotland, piloted by Hickson and navigated by Hayes. And their mission was to go and do that. Sadly, they were shot down just west of Oslo, and their aircraft crashed, and both men were killed. And their graves are actually right next to some of the freshman graves at the Oslo cemetery, which I only just found out. So I have now managed to trace both the families, and I'll be talking to them in Bolton at another lecture next year, which is the home of Hickson. But they were the first casualties of freshmen. So just before the mission set off, and this is just to emphasize how important this mission was seen. On the 17th, remember they left on the 19th, a memo was prepared by Lord Mountbatten, who was the head of combined operations, for the Prime Minister Churchill. And he basically gave the executive summary of what's about to happen. So this is the message that actually went to Winston Churchill 2 days before the raid. And I'll be talking about all this afterwards, but it just shows that he was given a special summary of what was about to happen. So he knew all about it, and he was waiting on the results. So the final preparations before the raid takes place. You have 18th of October, the grouse team are flown in. They land in Norway to get ready. There were a couple of injuries to the freshman party. So driver Sid Britton injured his leg about a couple of weeks before. He was kept with the group because for security reasons, they didn't want him being out anywhere else that he might say something. So he stayed with the group the whole time. And then just days before the mission, one of the officers in charge, Lieutenant Mike Green, he and Lieutenant Allen were cleaning the weapons in preparation for the raid. He had a jam in his gun, and as they were cleaning them, it went off, and he blew the top off his finger. So he had to be replaced by Lieutenant David Methven, who's pictured here, just before the raid. So he had done none of the training for it. He'd done none of the preparation. So he was briefed, obviously, extremely quickly. And this is his notebook here. And this is a list of the equipment that he had to get from the stores. So you can imagine him just that day before, or a couple of days before, saying, right, we need you to do this. This is what you have to get from the stores. And so this is his personal notes of what he had to pick up just before going. Incredible. The other thing that they changed, the Norwegian government asked, could you change the mission objectives and save 2 of the generators? Don't destroy them all, because we need them for the fertilizer production for Norwegian agriculture. Food was a real issue at the time. So they agreed to that. And then there was a nickeling flight, which is a leaflet dropping flight. They sent the 2 Halifaxes to Norway to try and do the route and drop leaflets over Oslo as a diversion, but basically to see if they could navigate. One succeeded, and they felt they could find the target. The other one had engine trouble out in the North Sea and just made it back. So only one of the aircraft completed that preparation or nickeling raid. And then all of the soldiers, at least for sure, would have probably written letters to their families just before they left. We have a number of examples which they wrote on the 19th, dated the 19th, which is the day they left. And they're all pretty much similar in that, dear mum and dad, or dear wife or brother or sister, you're not going to hear from me for a while. I'm off on a raid or a jaunt. Don't worry. And hopefully I'll be home by Christmas. Okay? They're all more or less the same thing. They're so poignant to read. And you realize that what happened afterwards, that they had actually told some of their friends when they were on their leave immediately before the raid, that someone had said, we're not coming back from this. So they had a feeling that they were not going to survive this. Then the commanding officers would have gone round everybody and said, have you made your will? And we've got several examples of wills that were dated the 19th, so people hadn't, and they were made sure, because that had big implications for the families, obviously. So that's the last minute. Just quickly show you a picture of some of the guys that took part. There are only 6 here. There's a mystery about who the flight engineer was on this flight. We still haven't been able to finally establish, but I'm still hoping to find. That's the aircraft that came back. These are the men that was on glider A, and we have several, I think 5 of the families are here today. This is Halifax B. We had a ceremony in Norway this past weekend for these 7 guys. Canadians, English, Scottish, and Jamaica. So a real international crew. And this is glider B. I just like people to see the photographs of these guys. So the raid, they eventually set off on the 19th. They had poor weather forecasts from the Norwegian weather officer, but at the location, the grouse team said the weather was clear. It had been clear for 4 nights in a row. It was clear that day, so they decided to go, and so they set off. The red is Halifax A. As they got close to the coast of Norway, they had problems with their guidance equipment. For this raid, the Halifaxes were equipped with what's called a Rebecca transmitter, and on the ground there was a Eureka system. And so you send a signal out from the aircraft, it's picked up by the equivalent set on land, and that helps guide the aircraft how far to the target. That would have been seen as essential for a raid like this. You're trying to land gliders on a pinprick in the Norwegian mountains. It's not an easy thing to do in winter or at any time. But the system failed as they approached the coastline, and that's why the red, you can see there's lots of loops. They kept trying to find their position again using standard navigation. And from what we understand, they probably got quite close. But they didn't fly over the landing zone. Halifax B, their Rebecca Eureka system worked fine, and the grouse team heard the plane flying overhead at the allotted time, but low cloud had come in and totally obscured the landing zone, so the flares they'd lit couldn't be seen. And I'm guessing that the pilot of the aircraft, he did not want to release the glider when he couldn't see where they were going to go, because that would have been tantamount to probably killing them. So neither plane was able to find the target, the drop zone or landing zone, and so they decided to head back to the UK, try and make it back to Skitton in Scotland. There were a couple of radio messages, one from Halifax B asking for a fix home, then nothing else. Halifax A, on their way back there, they went through some cloud. The tow rope got moist, and once it got wet, at that altitude and at that time of year, ice formed, a really thick layer of ice, and that starts to pull both aircraft down. So when you're towing a glider, the glider always sits above you. It can sit below, but usually above to avoid the slipstream. And so as the weight of the ice was pulling the rope down, then the glider's coming down in the slipstream of the bomber, starts to bounce around, and with the rope being brittle because of the ice, eventually it broke. And so they lost the glider, and they sent a message to say, glider released at sea. We don't know why they said that particular message, unless perhaps their navigation was such at that time. They were quite close to the sea. It may be that they thought they were actually over the sea. So only Halifax A returned after 8 hours flying, and Combination B did not return.
Well, I think my feelings were...
Sorry. First message that went out was from Mountbatten to Winston Churchill. So that's the letter he sent to say, sadly, we've heard from the grouse team, the gliders did not land. Only one aircraft came back, so the mission's a failure. And he wrote in red, he said, well, what do you mean? How many men have been lost and what special equipment are you talking about and so on. So the first person who was officially informed was the Prime Minister. 2 days afterward, and here comes the shock. 2 days afterwards, a news release came out from Reuters, which was published all over, including the UK and newspapers. A little thing, here's one from the Norwegian newspaper. But it basically said 2 British bombers, each towing a glider, penetrated in southern Norway on the night of the 19th. 1 bomber, both gliders were forced to land. The Sabotage troops were killed to the last man. That created massive consternation because that Lieutenant Colonel Henniker, he refused to believe this. He'd been in combat. He refused to believe you have an engagement where everybody is killed. There's always a wounded. There's always captured. And they thought the Germans were trying to play a bit of a trick in them to try and find out more information about who had gone on the mission, how many people we're talking about. But anyway, that was the first indication that something had gone gravely wrong. What we know now was that the 3 aircraft crashed, one up in a very remote valley up here in Filjesdalen, and then down here, the second glider and the Halifax. The Halifax crashed here and the glider on the other side of the valley. So all 3 of the aircraft crashed in southwest Norway. Halifax B, so the crash site, we were there on Sunday with some of the families. The locals heard the plane flying around. They heard it circling a couple of times, very, very low. And we're assuming that something similar had happened to its glider, that it had broken free. The broken tow rope was found by the farmers, local farmers. And the aircraft had circled around because standing orders are try and locate it so that you can pinpoint where it is. If it's at sea, then you can send a rescue vessel to try and rescue them. But unfortunately, they were over land in mountains, and as it circled low, it flew over a farm. It was seen by the local because it was so low. It went over the hill, and there was just a massive explosion. And so a bunch of locals went up there through the night with their lanterns and found the plane in a million pieces and everyone dead. Its glider crashed on the other side of the valley. It killed both glider pilots, the 2 Australians, and 1 other, a driver. He was killed in the crash or died shortly afterwards. But 14, including the officer, Lieutenant Allen, were in reasonably good shape. 1 man had a damaged leg, possibly broken, but the others were good. The glider pilot's done a fantastic job landing. That's the actual glider, taken the day after by a German soldier, and that's him there. And you can see his friends carrying stuff down from the glider. 2 soldiers were sent down by the officer to try and locate where they were. They came to a farm, talked to a Norwegian there who didn't understand them, got a bit nervous about having 2 guys in uniform appear at his door in the night, sent them to the local sheriff who lived nearby in this house. He then, they said, he spoke English. They said, we've crashed in a glider, we've got injured and dead, we need some medical assistance. And after some discussion, we don't know exactly how that transpired, but anyway, the local German garrison was informed because you've got 14 guys up on a hillside. You're going to need some help. You can't just disperse into the mountains. They're a long way from Sweden. So they sent out a lorry or a couple of lorries with troops to go and pick them up, which they did. Brought them back down to this farm and held them there, and then eventually drove them to the local army base, which is a short distance away. As they were leaving, some of the local Norwegians said they were in high spirits. They were play fighting out in the lawn in front of the house, and as they drove away, they were giving V signs and smiling. They were in good spirits. I guess you survived a crash where people have been killed. You're happy to be alive. So they arrived at the camp around about midday. They were photographed, taken to the hospital building, photographed, interrogated. This is where it went very pear-shaped. Because nobody realized at the time that only a few weeks before Adolf Hitler had issued his infamous Führerbefehl, or commando order, which stated that anyone engaged in sabotage action, whether in uniform or not, is to be executed within 24 hours. And if not, the person who doesn't carry this out will also face action. So there was a discussion between the German army garrison. It was the adjutant that was in charge at the time. The local commander was away. And also the German security service was alerted, the Gestapo. They wanted to take charge of them. The adjutant refused, and he decided to use the Führerbefehl and to execute them. So around 4 o'clock, all the locals were ordered at the camp. All the local Norwegians who were building roads and working in the kitchens and stuff, they were ordered home. The men were brought out one by one from the hospital building and taken down a road from the camp to the site there. And there they were shot by a firing squad, one by one. And their bodies were then placed in a shallow grave nearby. And at night, some POWs from Polish POWs were ordered to pick them up, taken to the coast, and they were buried there in a minefield. The other glider, it crashed in a very remote area, and there you had a couple of days before the Germans reached that. Local Norwegians were sent to assist. They tried to, as best they could, but this was a much more severe crash. 8 men were killed in the crash itself, and 3 or 4 others were critically injured. They eventually alerted the local farmer at this little house here, which is up there, and 3 of the soldiers walked down with him to the nearest telephone, which is down by the fjord. They called the local sheriff. She called the police headquarters in Stavanger. They informed the German security services and sent out some people to pick them all up. So eventually they were all picked up. The 9 survivors were picked up and brought back to Stavanger. They were all placed in this prison, which the Gestapo used, quite a small prison there. They were interrogated by the Gestapo. They sent an officer from Oslo to interrogate them. They had with them an SOE agent, this guy, Knut Kirkeby Jacobsen. He had been captured. He'd been captured a few weeks before, or a few months before, by the Gestapo near Oslo. And they thought they had turned him into a double agent. So he was actually asked to go with them because they felt, the Germans thought there might be some Norwegians in this group of 9 survivors. And they wanted a Norwegian to question them because he would know for sure if they were. So he went with him, and he's given us the real eyewitness account of what conditions were like for them in the prison and what happened to them. He escaped a few months afterwards and made his way back to the UK and gave a full report. During that first few days, 4 of the men were kept in Stavanger, and 5 were sent to the German concentration camp in Grini near Oslo. And those 4 men who were left there were murdered during that week by the Gestapo. 3 of them were killed with morphine injections, strangulation, all kinds of other things. They all accused each other of everything after the war, so it's hard to say exactly what. The 4th man just refused to succumb, and they took him to the Gestapo headquarters the next day. As he walked down the stairs, they shot him in the back of the neck. These photographs are really quite amazing because this is a reconstruction, obviously, after the war, but that is the guy. That is the Gestapo driver who shot him, and that's the Luftwaffe doctor who did the injections. And this is the hoodlum prison guard who helped. After they were dead, they stripped them, weighed them down with rocks and ropes, and dumped them at sea off the coast of Stavanger. So they have no known grave. The 5 survivors, they went to the prison camp at Grini, which is where they kept the Norwegian resistance fighters. So they were there for about 51 days. They were kept in isolation block in the main prison block here. They talked to other Norwegian prisoners every single day. In an isolation block, how do you do that? There are air vents near the floor of all the cells. If you lie down on the floor and talk through the air vent, you can talk to everybody in the block. Norwegians learned how to do this very quickly, so they talked to them every single day. They told them all about their families, each other. The British taught them Christmas carols. The British got better food than Norwegian prisoners for some reason, and they shared it. How did they share it? They tied it into little bags, and they hung it down strings from their cell to the cell below. And this letter is from a Norwegian prisoner thanking them after the war for sharing cheese and tobacco. So we know a lot about what happened to them there. But they were kept there for about 51 days. On the 18th of January, they were taken out from Greenie, taken to Trandum Wood, which is north of Oslo, and executed at dawn by the Gestapo. They were told they were going to a meeting with German officers. They were blindfolded, and they were told that they would be called to attention when the German officers arrived. But the Achtung order was actually the fire order, so they're standing lined up beside this grave that had been dug the day before, and on the order of Achtung, the firing squad shot them dead. So finding out what happened was a massive thing for the Allies afterwards. And they had a lot of wartime intelligence reports. They knew a lot about what had happened, way more than people realized. The intelligence services didn't share this with the investigating teams for some reason till well into the process. At some point they said, well, we have a report about this. I said, well, why didn't you tell us this before? You know, it's not the Google age. This was all done with paper. So there was a really strange German communique during the conflict. Communiques through the Red Cross were very common during the war. Basically said, we've identified a number of people who've been killed. You can now inform their families. But for some reason, the Germans, they were asked repeatedly about the freshman soldiers and aircrew and refused to give any information. Then suddenly, I think it was in 1944, they sent a list of about 8 or 9 names. It said, these guys died in a glider that we shot down over the sea. They were from both gliders, so it was a mixed group. And why they picked that group is just a mystery. But it had implications for the families, because the families at home, the wives, especially wives, and there were quite a few of them married, they are on soldiers' allowances and their married women's allowance, and if they've got children, and some of them had children, children's allowance. But the minute your husband's officially declared dead, you're then onto a war widow's pension, so your money gets cut. So they picked, for some random reason, this group of men, and they were then officially declared dead, and their families or their wives were on widow's pensions. The other ones didn't find out until the end of the war. Big challenge when the Allies took over Norway. There were around 375,000 fully armed German military personnel in Norway. The big worry was that they were going to fight on. They were essentially undefeated in their terms, and it was worried that they would do this. They didn't, thankfully. But you had to deal with them. And then they realized they had so many prisoners of war. Nobody realized you had almost more than 80,000 Russian, Poles, Czechs, all sorts. So there were a huge amount of people to deal with. So you had to maintain civil order, and you wanted to repatriate these people as fast as possible. But before you sent anyone back, you wanted to make sure that you'd identified and taken into custody all the bad boys. And there were a lot. So you had to register everybody first. A lot of the Gestapo tried to hide in amongst the normal troops and Air Force personnel. So as soon as the surrender came, they just stripped off their Gestapo uniforms and put on soldiers' uniforms. They had forged papers, and they hid in the camps with the German prisoners. They were never called prisoners of war, I should say. But they were held in the camps with the former German Army and Air Force. So you had to find a way of getting them. Registration process, you also had people that used to work for the security services here, and they would walk past them and they would just point them out and say, well, he's not a soldier, he is, the Gestapo chief of whatever. So they had a lot of that, and then they had to register all these guys. He was one of the very bad boys, and you had to register all the characteristics. Imagine the paperwork had to be done. 375,000 people, and you had to register the POWs as well. So it was a huge job. The war crimes investigation initially started with a small group of former police officers, because they didn't realize the scale of what they were dealing with at the time. So they were mostly police officers, but once they realized that it wasn't just Allied war crimes war crimes against Allied soldiers and airmen. But there was also the war crimes against the Russians and the Poles and everybody else. So it really, really expanded very quickly. But initially, you had the public service officers from the Civil Affairs Division, the former police officers, and you had others that helped them. This, I wanted to put this letter in because it's really quite fascinating. This guy, Major Neil Martin, he became a famous Conservative MP after the war, but he was one of the first people into the country. This is him here. And if you look at the notepaper he's writing, that is German security services notepaper. So he'd nicked the notepaper, that's what he was using. And very, very fascinating. It's a handover letter to the policeman. But he says, do hope you have enough to hang that bastard Probst. Probst was the adjutant who gave the order to shoot the soldiers at Schlettebe. And so they kind of knew who it was, but he just put that sentence, I hope you've got enough to hang that bastard Probst. That was his handover letter to the war crimes investigator. So when these guys came in, they used the local police, they used the local authorities, they put adverts in newspapers saying, does anybody know anything about what happened to some of these soldiers? And one article went in, turned up an eyewitness, this guy here, Christopher Varden. He's a local milk lorry driver who stayed in the area where the soldiers were buried in the sand dunes in the minefield. He'd been on his way home that evening, and he'd been stopped by a patrol and said, well, you can't come here. And he said, well, I live there. And he said, it doesn't matter, you can't come. So being a good Norwegian, he didn't let that stop him, so he just sneaked round, got up onto a bit of high ground, and could see what they were doing. He saw the lorries with the headlights on. He saw them pulling bodies out of this tarpaulin and burying them in the sand. So the next morning, he went back with a stick and he poked it into the sand, and he could feel that there were bodies there. And so he made a note. He got someone to come along and take a picture afterwards. And after the war, he could lead them to the spot. So after the war, they found the Glider B survivors there. As I say, the volume of investigations became too much just for the small civil affairs group of officers. So they formed a war crimes investigation branch. In 48 hours, they assembled a team of people, flew them to Norway. They were then split into teams, and they took charge of the war crimes investigation for the rest of 1945 and summed them into early 1946. At the end of 45, all the British troops and everybody were moved out, and everything, all prisoners still under investigation, went to Germany, and that's where they were dealt with. Right at the end of the conflict, there were a number of people that I call the escape justice guys. They were the ones that either disappeared or committed suicide. And there were a lot of people that committed suicide. You had some of the worst people here. Müller, who was the head of the Gestapo in Germany, he disappeared. Been a lot of speculation about whether he escaped to South America and lived a happy life, but the consensus is he probably died in Berlin in the last days of the war, but his body's never been found. You had Redis, who was head of the SS. You had Terboven, who was the Reichskommissar in Norway. They lived together in this big fancy house in Oslo, and so they committed suicide. Terboven, he blew himself up in a bunker with about 50 kilograms of dynamite. So there wasn't a lot left, as you can imagine, after that. Other people were killed during the war. So this guy here, Wilkins, he was the head of Gestapo in Stavanger. He had a major part to play in the killing of the soldiers there. He was actually killed by the Norwegian resistance in a raid on a radio station not far outside Stavanger. So they were sailing. This is the actual day he was killed. So that's the picture was taken while they were planning how to get to this island. So that's him. And Helmut Reinhardt, he disappeared at the end of the war and then turned up in the 1960s. They found him in the 1960s. He had another name previously. He took Reinhardt because it sounded more German. After the war, as I say, he disappeared. His wife made an official declaration to get him certified dead, which they did. And then she married this guy who happened to have the surname of this guy had before Reinhardt. So she remarried her husband with his old name, and they lived very well until he was found in the 60s. This guy was responsible for a lot of stuff in Norway during the war. He was sentenced to about 5 years and was released after about 3. So the trials, there were 3 cases: the 4 soldiers being killed in Stavanger, the 14 that were shot at Sletterbø, and the 5 who were shot at Trandum Wood. And that resulted in 5 separate trials. British military courts, some of you guys are probably military people. A military court is very different from a civil court. There are all kinds of things you can do in a military court that you've never get away with, and quite rightly so. You had to do things much faster. Rules of evidence were very different. Legal defense and prosecution teams were different. And what you find in this particular case was those cases that were early after the war, sentences tend to be much more severe. Particularly the first one that I'll come to in a second. Afterwards, once you got to Germany and you start to involve German lawyers and so on, the process took longer, the defenses became much more professional, and the consequences you see in the sentencing. But that's quite general. After the war, even for the Norwegians, traitors and so on who were caught, if they were caught and tried quickly after the war, death sentences were much more common. Afterwards, everybody was getting, the war's over, we don't have the appetite for this anymore, so things got more lenient. So the first trial, and the only one of the freshman trials was held in Norway, was this one for the 4 guys who were murdered in Stavanger, the 3 that were killed by the Luftwaffe doctor, and the 4th guy who was shot. The accused, Seeling, Hoffman, and Fairline. Seeling and Hoffman were sentenced to death. Fairline was sentenced to life imprisonment. Seeling was executed in Norway. So this picture here, this illustration here, is showing Quisling's execution at Akershus Festning, which is a fortress in Norway, in Oslo. And they built a shed with sandbags behind it, and this is where Quisling was shot. So we assume that Seeling's execution was quite similar. It happened around about at the same time. Hoffman, he was sentenced to be hanged. Now, here's the thing. Hanging's illegal in Norway. You can't hang people in Norway. So they had to take him to Germany to hang him. So they took him to Germany and executed the sentence there. Fairline was sentenced to life imprisonment. It was thought that he was handed over to the Russians afterwards and disappeared. He had committed a lot of crimes against Russian prisoners of war. But the German archives seem to show documents that show he went back some years after the war, back to his job as a painter and decorator, and died of a heart attack on holiday in Spain in the 60s. So. Second trial, so Colonel Probst, who was the guy who they thought was responsible, he died of cancer of the throat before coming to trial. That's him up there. So he wasn't tried. His boss, von Beeren, he was tried, and he was acquitted. It was felt that there was no proof that he had actually given a direct order to Probst to do this. He was acquitted. The third one was the man who was in charge of all German armed forces, von Falkenhorst. Interesting picture, because this is him in his finery. And for trials, they let them keep their uniforms, but they stripped them of all military insignia. They didn't want them looking impressive, so they made sure that they knew they were prisoners. And he was initially allowed to leave Norway at the end of the war. Nobody thought he'd done anything that was worthy of a war crimes trial, so he was allowed to leave. And then during the investigation, they found out that he had actually been more active in implying and modifying the Hitler order than they'd realized. So he was sought after. They found him in Dachau, in the prison camp there, in the American zone. He wasn't being held for committing any crime. He's being held as a witness for other war crimes that were going on in Germany. So he was brought to trial in Germany, He was convicted, sentenced to death, then he was commuted to 20 years imprisonment, then he was released in 1953 on medical grounds, and lo and behold, he lived to 1968 on those medical grounds. So, the fourth trial was this firing squad in Oslo, the Gestapo firing squad. 13 of them were identified. There were probably about 30 people involved in total, but 13 were identified. 9 were convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. 4 were acquitted. All were released in 1952. Some of these guys had been involved in a large number of executions, but they were all released. This guy, he was the head of the Sonderkommando, the head of the firing squad. He probably oversaw about 300 executions in Norway during the war. Mostly Norwegian resistance people, but also some Russian prisoners of war and the British, the freshman guys. So he was tried by the Norwegians first, because obviously he had been responsible for a lot of those firing squads. He was tried by them first, and he was originally convicted and then released on appeal, because he stated, and there was no proof against the fact, that every time he carried out an execution, he was given written orders by his superior and was told that they'd been subject to a trial and they'd been legally found guilty. And there are no laws against executing people if that's the case. And so the Norwegians couldn't prove it, and so they released him into the hands of the British, who were gratefully accepting. He was tried by the British. He was sentenced to death, but again, it was commuted to 15 years in prison. He was released in 1954 and disappeared. So we've no idea what happened to him. So he saw around about 300. He was in charge of about 300 executions. So, was justice served? Well, 41 of the 48 men who took part in the raid, they lost their lives. 21 were killed in the crashes, 4 were murdered in Stavanger, 14 shot at Slettebø, and 5 in Trandum Wood. Some of the Germans who were involved, they committed other crimes. 2 of them were shot by the Norwegian resistance in gun battles with them before the end of the war. There were 4 that committed suicide. 6 were never traced, and there were probably more. 5 were tried by Norwegian courts. The court system, there was an agreement between the Allies and Norwegians. Basically, whoever had the most likelihood of getting a strong conviction, they would take precedence. So the Allies liked, especially the British, liked to try everybody, but they agreed that sometimes the Norwegians had a case that would be more likely to get a death sentence, so they allowed them to do it. That happened with these 2 particular cases. 19 members of the German army and security services were charged with freshman-related crimes. 2 were executed, 5 acquitted, and the others were long prison sentences, but all released in the early 50s. So it's an open question. There's the graves of a lot of the freshman guys in Helland at Eiganes, and here is von Buren, and he lived his life and went back to whatever he was doing, like so many of these guys did. So open question, but that's what you see. And with that, thank you for your attention. Okay. Happy to take questions, yes, and comments. Yes, my friend.
Yeah. First of all, the mother's birthday was on the 20th of November.
No.
So every year, you can imagine.
Wow.
Well, I was only 2 years since
Yeah.
as I got that bit older and older.
Yeah.
You know, come out here, every day was given on my mother's birthday or whatever. Also, there was a book written, it was called Up for These Men.
Yeah.
And it had all them men's names in it. I think it was written by the man that actually done on your country,
Yeah.
done the operation.
Yeah.
You know, on the ferry boat.
Yeah.
He wrote that book.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, my sister got it, and she told me that one of her friends up at one of the pubs in the East End lent it to her.
Yeah.
But then quite a long while later, I mentioned it, whatever, she said, no, they had it in all church library. So when they still got that store, because they've got a room
Well,
with all them very old books, you know, about the history and all that around our area.
Wow.
But I've got no car now, so I might get one of these to have a look.
I'm sure I can find it for you, Bob. I'm sure I can find it. I'm good at finding books. I'm good at finding these books. Yeah. Good man. I will look for it for you. Yeah. So I'm open to any questions you like. Please fire away. So.
Why were these being released in the 50s?
That's a good question. So it was, I think it was more to do with the division of Germany, East and West Germany. A lot of the people were held in one sector or the other, and nobody wanted the responsibility of keeping them in one sector, or their homes were elsewhere. So I think they just made a general kind of agreement to shift prisoners from one sector to another, and I think they just decided to. It was a political thing. It wasn't really it was nothing to do with their sentencing or being nice to them. It was more just the politics of let's make life simpler for everybody. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So it was. Yeah.
This isn't a question, but something I saw that made me chuckle as an army brat. The chappie who was assigned very late at the last moment his list, he had foot powder.
Yeah.
And that took me back to the little green. Do they still make that?
I imagine they still use foot powder of some description.
That was the best. It was so fine.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yes, wasn't it just? Yeah. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, no. The reason I'm looking is because I've got some pictures I was showing people earlier. I might try and find it for you, of the kit. So keep firing questions at me while I fiddle like Nero here. Go on, there must be more questions. Go to me.
Question for you.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to investigate this? What's your connection to it? Have you got a connection?
I got no connection whatsoever, other than my granddad was a Royal Engineer. No, it's so I'm a geologist by training. I worked in Norway for many, many years in the oil industry. I'm always been fascinated by military history. One of my things is to go to graveyards, particularly Commonwealth graveyards. My poor wife, she comes with me everywhere. She'll admit to it as well. She likes the graveyards. And in Eigenes in Stavanger, they have a very nice Commonwealth plot there. And you see that there's a large number of graves, all Royal Engineers, airborne, and all with the same date. And so whenever you see something like that, you know something has happened. It's not just an air crash. Something has happened. And so I just started to dig into it. I came in contact with some people who'd written books on this, and it just grew like topsy from that time. Now I'm officially retired, and this has been pretty much a full-time occupation for about 5 years, tracing the families and writing a new book on this and giving presentations. So of the 48 men who took part, I now have family contacts for 39. Plus the 2 guys in the Mosquito, that's relatively new. And as I say, there are 19 family members here today, which is cool, and we're all in touch with one another. And I had 46 or 47 to Norway for the 80th anniversary. We had 8 days where we visited all the crash sites, the execution sites, the cemeteries, and we ended up at the British Embassy for a very nice reception with the ambassador. So
and we
yes.
went to Rukjan as well.
What's that, Darren?
And we went to Vemork.
Yes, and we went to Vemork as well, which was amazing. Yeah, it was. So yes, the obsession comes from
Well done.
yeah.
Historical
stop.
Once you start, once you give me a task, I can't stop. Yeah.
What do you
Just
Thing. Yeah.
Just speaking of graves, what was the update on changing the date on?
Yes.
graving on
For people who don't know, the 5 graves in Oslo. The date on those, there's actually 6. I should have said that. 5 freshman soldiers were shot, and also a sailor, a British sailor, Bob Evans. He'd been captured on a raid, on an attempt to sink the Tirpitz in a mini sub, and they took him to Greeny shortly before the freshman soldiers were executed, and he was put in with that group. So he was shot on the same day. So his date of death is given as the 19th of January, 1943, and the freshman soldiers is given as the 18th of January, 1943. Now, given that they were all shot at the same time, one of those dates is wrong, and so I've been discussing with the Commonwealth Graves Commission to try and get the dates altered. The reason I'm so strong on the 19th is because I have the Norwegian archive record of the prison log from Greeny, which shows the time and date they were signed out, and that's the 19th. A Norwegian prisoner gave a statement after the war that said they were taken out on the 18th, but he didn't have a calendar, and that was his best estimate. So they based it on that. Initially they'd said the 19th, but they based it on that. So we will get there, Keith. We had Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, visiting. She talked to me about this, which was very cool, because she's now the patron of Commonwealth Grave Commission. So it will get done, but it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. Sorry, you were saying.
I was going to say, what are you researching now?
Yes. So the specific thing right now is this war crimes part. So I'm almost finished that. Sorry, I need my glasses because I can't see my own. So that's what I'm working most on just now. And the rest of it is pretty much done. But the war crimes part was bigger than I realised and a lot more complicated, which is why it's taken me so long to get this done. Come on, Bruce. There we go. So, this morning, thank you to the Royal Engineers Museum, we were having a look at some of the artifacts, but also got some very, very cool compilations of the equipment. So one of the recreation military history groups, Poor Bloody Infantry, who have helped me quite a lot with this, they compiled the full kit list of a freshman for the freshman raid, and obviously each soldier wouldn't have carried all this stuff because they have the Sten gun here and the Lee Enfield, about half and half they were. But this is the kind of kit list they had. So they had the ski clothes, they had the helmet. There's a helmet. Sapper Smith's helmet is in the display here at the Royal Engineers Museum, the big dent in it. Sapper Smith was one of the poor guys murdered in Stavanger, but his helmet is in the museum. And we were having a look at the ski gloves and so on. But this is the kind of kit they would have had. And down here is their blue pullovers and ski trousers. So quite a lot of stuff to carry, plus the explosives. So I mean, this is them dressed with the stuff on. So you imagine just carrying that kit. They had very good sleeping bags, actually. I was going to show you that. So those up there, really, really good sleeping bags. There's one here in the museum. There's one in the Army Flying Museum. And the one in the Army Flying Museum was taken by, remember I showed you the picture of the glider and the German soldier bringing the kit down? He nicked it at the time, along with a rucksack and various other bits and bobs. and he used the sleeping bag for a long, long time. And then in the 80s, he took it to handed it over to the museum. So there's a picture of him handing it over. So the sleeping bags were top quality. So they had some good kit. String vests, state of the art, state of the art. Germans commented quite a bit on their string vests. They thought these are really. Yeah, it could well be. Yeah, yes it is. Yes it is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's string vest. Seriously, the Germans thought this. Ooh, that's quite cool. Yeah, of course. I always had to wear them when I was a kid. My mum insisted on the string vest. So they did have some innovations, but if you look at D-Day, Arnhem, and so on and so forth, the quality and thinking about the equipment and so on, it was different. This was 1942, and although they had some special training, I didn't have time to talk to you about all the training, but they had some special training. But compared to what a special forces soldier would have, or a commando, it was quite limited. They only had a few weeks. They did some specialist explosive training. They practiced on something that looked like a heavy water cell, that type of thing. But these troops were Royal Engineers that had a bit of special training. They weren't like the troops you saw in the 1st Airborne Division going in to Arnhem and so on and so forth. That was a different level of training altogether. Yeah, come on, there must be more questions than that. And you can always talk to me afterwards. I'm here for the rest of the day. So yes.
And when are you thinking of finishing the book?
So this morning when I talked to the relatives, I said, "There's only one question you're not allowed to ask me." When's that? Yeah, sometime soon. Yeah. No,
It must be very thick.
Those of you who remember your youth in the Encyclopedia Britannica, that's pretty much where I'm at the moment. So you have to take a chapter that's 150 pages down to 20. So when I've done that for them all, then we're there. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff. There are thousands of archived documents and photographs and letters. And I showed you a couple of the letters. So that's key for me is to kind of show who they were. Show people who the men were, and also a bit about their families. And a lot of them, as I say, were married. Several of them had kids. 2 of the men never saw their children. These stories need to be told. It's not just numbers. It's not just 10 soldiers were killed on some raid somewhere. These were real people. 18 years old was the youngest guy. 18, and he was the last one to be shot at Sletteberg. I didn't have time to tell you all the details, but it took them 2 hours to do this. It took them 2 hours. So the first volley of shots, everybody in that line would have known what was about to happen. They were spaced 80 meters apart, each flanked by 2 German soldiers. The guy with the damaged leg, he was in a chair. And so every time they stopped, he had to sit down. They would help him along, and then he sat down in the chair. 2 hours. So that's the kind of thing the detail that it's important for people to realize. This must have been so hard for these guys. They had been flying in this glider. They would have been really sick. It's freezing cold in these things. They were told to wear every item of clothing they had and get in your sleeping bags. So they were in their sleeping bags in the glider on the trip. 3.5 hours there, circling around for a bit, and then heading back. So it was like 5+ hours in that glider. And it would have been really rocky towards the end when it was bouncing about. And then they crashed.
How long between the failure or the end of this raid and planning for the start of the SOE raid?
Instant. It was absolutely instant. Literally within like a couple of days. And that's a really interesting point, because they hoped, most people don't realize, but they had actually hoped to do the raid before Christmas. So Gunnerside was actually, they were hoping to do it before Christmas, but weather conditions and other things worked against them, so the raid didn't actually take place until the following year. But it was instant. Basically, Combined Operations said, "Oh my goodness, now what?" And SOE stepped in and said, "Okay, they already had a basic plan to how to attack these power stations. They built a basic plan how to attack all Norwegian facilities at an early stage, so that they were ready if they needed to do anything. So they needed to detail up, but they already had a lot of technical information from the freshman preparations. They had detailed hand-drawn sketches that had been smuggled out just before the freshman raid, and plus the guys who did it, gunner side, a lot of them were local to the area, and so they knew what they were doing. But the planning started instantly after. Yeah. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, and as I say, you can talk to me afterwards if there's anything you want to. I'm here. So thank you again for your attention.